Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to have Jyotishman, who is based in the United States. He is the host of India and Global Left, which hosts progressive voices from around the world. So Jyotishman, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thanks, Prajwal. Thanks for having me.
So Jyotishman, we can start off by talking about your background and how the idea to start India and Global Left came about.
Oof. Okay, so I grew up in Assam in a small village called Japarkuchi. I did my schooling from Assam, and then I studied engineering from Rourkela, and I graduated in 2016. I worked for Larsen and Toubro for a couple of years, where I really got the working class culture. I was able to understand the working class culture better because as a junior engineer, I was not involved much in project formulation. I was mostly in the implementation. So I was in touch with labor contractors, and I figured out that Larsen and Toubro, apparently a multinational corporation, works on or works by employing informal labor. These are informal in the sense that they are not daily wage earners, but they are often recruited on 3 monthly contracts, 4 monthly contracts. And I figured out how poorly they are paid. So that's the economic shift that happened to me in 2016 because I came from the tech world, and I was also a product of the post-liberal India where there was a lot of excitement, at least prior to 2008, or in Indian case, I would say 2010, when the economy started to slow down. There was a lot of excitement about especially within the middle class, but also to some extent within the working class about technology and liberal economy. And so there was a break in my thought there. And the political background was the sort of rise of the reactionary right globally, whether it's Trump or Bolsonaro or Modi and Yogi. I could sense very clearly the limits of liberal democracy. And as I studied more about liberal democracy, I figured out that liberal democracies are not just fragile, but they are also very exclusive. And so there, my focus shifted more and more towards understanding the economy and politics in a more radical ways. And I resigned from my job to study humanities. I studied history. I graduated, and then I moved into my PhD, where my research is more and more about economic history. So I study more about economics and history. But apart from that, as you mentioned, I have a YouTube channel called India and Global Left, where we focus on geopolitics, on economic, on a whole range of issues from a global perspective, and we interview progressive people. So sorry for the slightly longer introduction.
No, no, it was very interesting to hear about your background. So, we all know that the national security discourse all around the world is dominated by people on the right and nationalists, and they have very few progressives who influence national security discourse in the country. So, according to you, I would like to ask you what is the importance of having progressive voices in foreign policy and how influential are they?
That's a very good question. If you read the New York Times, or if your audience is Indian, I would restructure my answer in a more Indian context. If you read the Hindu, for instance, it's not a reactionary newspaper, or for that matter, even the Indian Express. I mean, they have sort of center left kind of take on most issues. They would not have terrible ideas about caste. They would not have terrible ideas about on gender. But when it comes to foreign policies and foreign relations, you would realize that they are actually very regressive. they kind of toes the mainstream nationalist um, hegemony or mainstream nationalist line of confronting China, confronting Pakistan, presenting India as the center of the globe, and as if our future lies in building more aircrafts or buying more aircrafts from the Western powers rather than in sitting down with dialogues in good faith across the borders and so on and so forth. So foreign policy is, I think, this bellwether test about how progressive you are, because you can always, it's relatively easier to have a progressive view, let's say when it comes to informal labor, because it's so visible. But when it comes to national interest, because we are so much soaked in by these institutions of nation states, it's very difficult to see beyond them. And so I think the Indian expresses and the Hindus are dominated by people, who come from the tradition of national interest, and so there is a great danger in um, in promoting and in encouraging and in reproducing hostile relations between nations. Um, and I think that's why it's all the more important for people outside these established institutions and even journals and newspapers to think about foreign policies from a more radical perspective. And by radical perspective, I mean opposing hierarchies among nations. So if we are thinking about India Nepal relationship, we should be more sensitive about what people in Nepal are thinking about India's aggressive posturing. If we are thinking about India and Bangladesh, we should be very critical about how we deal with our neighboring nations. And so that's the kind of critical perspective which I think in foreign policy is more difficult than other issues. And so I think it's all the more important to have voices outside the mainstream, and not the university intellectuals, not the think tanks, and of course not those who work inside the government, but those who are outside to advocate for peace. I remember the reading very early in my life this um, working class documents from the First International during the Franco-German, Franco-Prussian War at the time. And the working class in Germany were writing to the working class in France saying that this Franco-Prussian war is a bullshit. I mean, they didn't use the word bullshit, but they said that it's a bourgeois war between the ruling elites, where the working people have no interest in, whether we are working as military personnel or whether we are working in factory, our lives are at risks and we are sent to the borders to die. And this is what politicians do. They gaslight people. When politicians gaslight Indians to fight Chinese, they know that they would be sitting in New Delhi in a very safe place. It is those people who go into the borders who die, and these are the most excluded people. They often come from the marginalized sections. They are not you and me. We go to Western universities because we come from the elite sections, and those who are excluded from this system, they go out there, they fight, and they die. So our task, if we are to call ourselves progressive, is to oppose these kind of policies that put people at risk, that place nations at risk, and really move, I would say, eventually to work, if not abolish borders, at least minimize the relevance of nation states and national borders.
That's a very interesting perspective, I would say. So, considering the importance which progressives must have in the foreign policy decision making, I would like to ask you who, according to you, are amongst the most important progressive foreign policy voices in the world?
I mean, it depends on who you are thinking of. If you are thinking of people inside governments, then there are always realists. And these are voices you would find in all governments. Sometimes some of them make headlines, sometimes some of them don't make headlines, but these are essentially, starting from ambassadors who work in foreign offices to people in the executive and legislature. You would always find this sort of maybe minority of voices who are progressive in the sense, not that they believe in some radical idea of going beyond nation states, but they are progressive in the sense that they believe in the realist principle, and they believe that if we confront nations, if we go for war, it doesn't help us. And so I would place. I mean, there are many. It depends on which government you would like to look at and which point in history. So it's a very broad question, but I think I would. That's my response in a more on a more abstract sense. But if we'll discuss some of the specific international relations, then I would be able to pinpoint a few names.
Yeah. So we have seen the student encampments all prop up all around the world from the past 1 month. So do you finally see a shift in foreign policy after these encampments have come up all around the world in terms of the Israel-Gaza war and the other wars going on in the world?
We have to first recognize the limits of not just student protests, but how difficult it is for civil disobedience or popular demonstrations to immediately influence policymakers. So, if you are thinking about the US war machine or the military empire, it's very, very hard for student protesters to change or influence it immediately. That said, I think what we saw in the US in particular was pretty remarkable. I mean, the US campuses have not seen such protests for a very long time. I mean, the civil rights movements in the 60s and the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in the 70s are now like 50 years behind us. And since then, we haven't really seen. I mean, there were occasional protests during the anti-apartheid movements in the late 1980s in South Africa, and a couple of protests, very minor, like Colombia and elsewhere uh, during the invasion of Iraq, but not to this extent. So these protests that we saw after the Israeli atrocities that started since October 8 on Palestinian people have really been a great, I think, matter of educating the American people at large, but also the world in general. So they are questioning about how university fundings are used in buying Israeli stocks, in investing in U.S. pension funds and mutual funds, in Israeli stocks and bond markets, and so on and so forth. I mean, we don't know how much of this money goes into Israel exactly, because these fundings are very dubious and intransparent. But these questions are being raised. So it's essentially deepening and widening some of the on ground movements like the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in Palestine that has been going on for a very long time. So it is in that spirit. We have to understand that democracy has never come from the top. Democracy has mostly come from oppressed people, by working people struggling for greater rights. So, in the context of the US, a lot is talked about the US American Revolution, which was revolutionary to the extent that it was trying to break off from the British metropolis. But it was not revolutionary in the sense of including a lot of people. If you look at the real drives for inclusions, these are the movements like the civil rights movements where African American or black people actually push for getting democratic rights, or earlier during the New Deal, the laboring class, really became citizens. They got union rights, they got a whole bunch of rights, and then throughout the 70s and the 80s, U.S. militarism was questioned. Women and others came in large numbers. So I see the significance of these protests that we saw recently, and are still continuing at various places, is really about educating American citizens about the Middle East, Palestine in particular, about the US empire, about the divergence between the US ruling elite and people at large, and really about making US one of an ordinary nation, like others. By ordinary, I mean not having the license to topple governments, not having the license to drop bunker busters on people, not having the license to veto the General Assembly, and so on and so forth. To that extent, I think there has been results. If you look at the beginning, like October, November, the Biden administrator started by doubling down on the mainstream narrative. So it was all about Hamas, and how terrible the Palestinians are and how insecure Israel is. And now today, as we speak, we have come to reach the point where Biden openly goes out and says that Netanyahu and his war cabinet is vetoing the ceasefire and the peace process because of his own political gain. It's a significant shift. I mean, the U.S. is the biggest success of the Israelis is that it has been able to have a very bipartisan support of the Americans throughout history. So whether it's the Republicans or whether it's the Democrats, there used to be no difference of opinion when it comes to the matter of Israel. But now we are seeing significantly within a sections of the Democrats who are questioning some of the ways and means in which Israel deals with Palestinians in particular. So to that extent, I think we cannot ignore the significance of these demonstrations and uprisings in the US.
So, do you think voices like Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio Cortez are finally heralding a shift in the US Israeli policy? How important has their voice been?
Sanders hasn't been very useful, honestly, to for the Palestinian cause. I mean, he has, and it also has to do with his sort of compromise with the Biden and the sort of centrists after his defeat in 2020 primaries. So yes, he has made occasional statements about Israeli atrocities, but he has never been very helpful. I would encourage your viewers to see his interview with Novara Media, where he was completely exposed when he was asked about fundamental questions on Palestine, whether it was on settlement, whether it was about the Palestinian state. I am not sure whether he was asked about things like right of return, but he has not been very radical at all. But people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others from the squad, maybe even not Ocasio Cortez, because she has been, her position in Ukraine in particular has been very, very dubious. On Palestine, her position seems to be okay, but when your position on war is not consistent across the board, then those activists who work for anti-militarism, anti-empire, anti-imperialism, they don't find you very helpful. So yes, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and others, there are many from particularly Arab Americans, but also other progressive voices from Black community and so on. They have been very progressive. But by and large, I would think the push has come from the uprisings below and voices outside the establishment. So even people like Jeffrey Sachs, people like Norman Finkelstein, people like even John Mearsheimer, these are people who which the US establishment cannot completely ignore. And so I think that has been rather more helpful.
That's a very illuminating point. Mike, I also had a question about why these people, the so called progressive in the US, have a different position on the Russia Ukraine war and the Israeli Palestinian war. Somewhere it appears that their positions appears to be dubious in some sense because they are encouraging the United States to supply more weapons to Ukraine, whereas in Israel, we know the atrocities that are being committed by Israel, but they're calling for a drawback in the sale of weapons to Israel. So, why do you think there's a difference?
Well, it depends on how you look at the two situations. I mean, they wouldn't say that their positions are inconsistent, because their argument would be that it's Hamas and the Palestinians who are the aggressor. And particularly in this case, I mean, the earlier cases of atrocities were somewhat different from this, in the sense that the Hamas fighters really didn't respond to an immediate assault on October 7. They were responding to a much long-term atrocities and oppression of the Palestinians. So to that extent, the mainstream narrative has been that Hamas started the war, Hamas is the aggressor, and so what Israel is doing is in response, and so we have to support them. It is in their self-defense, and even though we kill like more than 30,000, 36,000 people, even though we create like millions of tons of rubble that would take like years to clear, it's really in the self-defense. On Ukraine, they would say that it's Russia who has invaded. So the mainstream narrative has been that Putin is this sort of, whether it's a mad person or an expansionist, he's trying to revive the Soviet Union, which was an expansionist union. I mean, these are all mainstream narrative, and of course bullshit. And so Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, or later, its occupation. I mean, these are mainstream words of Crimea are only some pieces of taking over Ukraine and eventually Eastern Europe, and the craziness is even maybe all of Europe. And so Putin and Russia is the aggressor, and what we are doing through Ukraine is defending against an aggressive power. So I don't think that they see that their positions are different, apart from the fact that there is a recognition in, which is sort of such a brazen fact that no one can ignore that, which is that Palestinians are really helpless, in the sense that they don't have the might that Putin has. To that extent, there are probably more people who can have some sense of solidarity, if not a radical solidarity with Palestinians, unlike in the case of Russia, where Russia is a superpower, at least militarily speaking. So Russia can be lampoonized, or lumpenized, and all sorts of narrative is easier in the case of Russia.